So Andrew, welcome. So you work on diseases of wheat, barley, cereal crops. What do diseases look like in a dry year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when you think about diseases, we have some in wet years, we have some in what people call moderate years, and we have some in dry years. And this year is a perfect example of a dry year type of disease situation. And although we can see them, they probably aren't going to be as impactful as the ones that you see in wet disease years.
So you tend to have a little less diseases. What happens to a disease that loves water? A fungal disease, splash disperse, maybe thinking Fusarium head blight. What happens to that in a dry year?
Yeah, so when you have a dry year, may think some of those wet favorable diseases like Fusarium may just go away, but they kind of just hang out. They may not be producing as many spores, they may not produce as much fungal mass, but they're still going to be there. And the best way I can put it is using Fusarium head blight as an example is, if we go back to 2017, when the Hettinger area was very, very dry, and there was a lot of concerns of, obviously, there's no crop out there. 2018 and 2019 turned into being some of the worst scab years. So how does that translate? Well, I think the best example is we know those pathogens are always there, but they use that weather more or less to produce as much as they can in the limited time that they have. And I think that's a perfect classic example of it just being here. We're married to those type of pathogens. Just more or less you see an ebb and flow based off the weather conditions.
Yeah, so it's not that they're going away. They're just blowing up when it's dry or blowing up when it's wet, depending on what it is.
Yeah, they just take advantage of the situation that's given to them, and I call them a critter, and that's exactly what they do. They have their own type of lifestyle that they prefer.
So I don't know a lot about diseases. How long do they live in the soil, or is it different time spans for different diseases, or how are they always there?
Yeah, it depends. So it depends on the class of pathogen you're dealing with. Some can survive 8 to 10 years. I know in Sam's crops, he has some uromycetes or water-loving fungi that can survive a very long time in the field. And when you switch to bacterial diseases, maybe a year. So it's all across the board. So just knowing what you have is, if it's a fungal disease, bacteria, fungal-like disease, it's going to vary depending on how long they stick around.
Yeah. So Jan, we're talking about things in dry years. So what do insects do in a dry year?
Oh, well, there's lots of insects that are worse during a dry year, especially a drought. And we saw that this year, where you saw a lot of grasshoppers and all field crops, and it was statewide this year. So they were a major problem, especially once they reach the adult stage later in the summer. They can be very devastating because they can fly and move around to find greener crops. And we saw that this year. Once the small grain harvest came off, we started to see them move into our soybeans, our dry beans, and sunflowers, and field corn. So, and another pest that was real common this year on the soybeans and dry beans was the spider mites. They started get going in late summer again, once we had those 90s, and the hot, dry weather can really increase their reproductive rate. And we saw the spider mites starting out in the edge early, and then they just spread and got into the whole field. So those were probably the two key ones that we saw. But also there's a lot of natural control with insect pests, and we need wet weather for that, and we didn't have the wet weather, so the fungal diseases that attack insects weren't present this year. So that's some of the reasons why we saw more cereal aphids, for example, in the small grains.
Interesting. So we just visited with Miranda and Kevin, and I heard about blister beetles this summer too. How does that work? Is that related to the drought?
Actually, it's related to the drought and grasshoppers.
Okay.
So the blister beetles, this particular species that we saw this year, that group, the Epicata group, they feed on grasshoppers. So when the grasshoppers are high, they're going to be high. So, and there's a whole group of them, the black, the striped, and they really increase because of the grasshoppers, which is their host.
I see.
So.
Interesting. I didn't know all these things, so I'm trying to figure out what to ask. Okay, but you see one bug, you don't go and spray. There are thresholds and things like that, right, for both fungicides and also pests, I'm assuming, maybe? But what is it for, what are your recommendations for how you manage these critters?
Well, we recommend scouting and, getting out, weekly at least, and checking your crops for the different pests. And we have our guides that Sam and Andrew and Joe Eichley produce, the North Dakota Field Crop Insect Management Guide. And it kind of summarizes all the insect pests by crop, and the thresholds are all in the guide, as well as all the insecticides that are registered in North Dakota and their use rates. So, we recommend IPM, Integrated Pest Management, and getting out and scouting regularly and routinely, and then looking for the key pests that we might find. And then also subscribe to the Crop and Pest Report, our summer newsletter. We kind of summarize all the information in there and what's hot and what we're seeing a lot of, because we have IPM scouts throughout the whole state looking for different diseases. We focus mainly on wheat, barley, soybean, and sunflowers.
Excellent. So you mentioned spider mites, I think. So
Yeah.
you got the guide there.
Yep.
So can you use an example? Maybe what's the economic threshold on spider mites? Maybe in
Well, I got a lot of farmers calling me because they didn't understand what the threshold was, and it is difficult because the spider mite is so small. They're on the underside of the leaf, the bottom of the plant, so they're difficult to see. You may see the damage or the feeding injury, but you don't often see the mites, depending how good your eyes are. You may need a 10x hand lens. But we recommend just
struggle.
using a white sheet of paper and then wrapping the plant over that sheet of paper, and you can see the tiny mites moving around. They look like a dot, period, on a piece of paper. They're that small, about 500 microns. So, that's the best way to look for them. And then the threshold in soybeans and dry beans, which is the two crops we had the worst problems on, is when they're starting to move up into the middle canopy. So you'll see some mites present there, and you also see the stippling. The early damage is like a stippling on the leaf because they feed on the green chlorophyll. So when they extract that chlorophyll from individual cell, it looks like a white spot. So you'll see a bunch of stippling, and as the damage gets worse, it starts to yellow the leaf, and then eventually it turn brown and drop off, but you don't want to see that. But anyway, so the threshold is when it's just starting to be mainly in the middle part of the canopy, very little into the upper where the pods are, and then also very little yellowing, just a little in the lower canopy. So, and there's a YouTube video on how to scout for spider mites that's available through NDSU Extension in soybeans and field corns.
So I want to make
Thank
sure
you,
we
Jen.
ask you a question, though, too, about the dry conditions for something like SCN or the other broadleaf diseases that might be out there.
Yeah, we, things like white mold, where you have really heavy water dependent, those things you don't see much in a drought year. But what you do tend to see is that late in the season, some of the diseases that are more favored by dry. So like SCN's a nematode. So think of it as like a nightcrawler or a worm. When you have lots of rain, the nightcrawlers all crawl up on the sidewalk or wherever they get out of there. Well, SCN's kind of the same. It does not like water. So when it's dry, it's more able to infect. It reproduces more. And then if you have a parasite on the roots and the plants are already water stressed, it will really do some damage. So something like soybean cyst nematode really blows up in drought years. There's another one called charcoal rot, and that infects really early in the season, but it really only shows up if it's dry, and that can infect soybeans, particularly in corn and sunflowers and a few others. So there are some diseases that show up, but we see a lot less of the common things, bacterial blights, white mold. They just kind of go away.
So are we going to see an explosion of some of these diseases? Like you're saying, the SCN is kind of building this year. Are you going to see it explode next year in the crop if you put soybean on soybean or something like that?
Yeah, what I think will happen this year is that people that know they have SCN, they're probably testing for it, they're probably managing it, they're going to see some of those spots show up. The people that have it but don't know, they might start to see some yellow areas in fields right now is showing up. Get in there and take a look and see what that is, because SCN often doesn't show up until August, and it shows up best when it's dry. It's a good opportunity. If there's an opportunity in a drought, it's a good opportunity to see what's going on as far as your soil-borne pathogens.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example too, because when you start thinking about how much pathogen or what's in the soil, it's really dependent on what it's given to. Like SEN is a perfect example of what could be potentially next year. And some of the crops I work on, charcoal rot, you mentioned that, can hit corn too. We might see a little bit more of that. It might increase that population, but is it going to be a problem next year? Well, a lot of factors go into it, with weather often being our most important, and then what type of varieties or hybrids that we're putting in that field too.
Yeah, identification is the key, and if you have the opportunity to get in and learn something that you can, even if the yields aren't that great, or even if the crop doesn't look that great, usually there's a reason for that. And if you can identify that reason, you can manage it better in the future. A lot of these pathogens, maybe most, will stick around for multiple years. So any information now can help you in future seed selection or seed treatments or budgeting in a fungicide application, or whatever it is, the management tools that you're using. Speaking of management tools, Jan, so the EPA announced revoking tolerances of chlorpyrifos on August 18th. That was like last week.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, this is going to affect the entire agriculture industry. Anyone who uses chlorpyrifos or lorsban and generics products, so it'll be crop producers, animal producers, food manufacturers, pesticide manufacturers, and distributors. So it's going to impact a lot of people, and we're going to need to figure out what alternatives we have for management of some pests in different crops. But yes, that is going to be published probably within the next 6 months on the official register. So then we will no longer be able to use it. So it's mainly going to impact us next year. In 2022, we won't have it anymore, and that will include any premixes with chlorpyrifos or lorsban and generics as well, like Cobalt Advanced. So it's a huge loss for the agriculture industry, because we had some pests that are difficult to control, and lorsban and generics were always our go-to for controlling those pests like spider mites. So we have one less tool in our toolbox now for management of some of these insect pests. But if you did use it this year for control of mites or any other insect, you're okay as long as the application was made prior to the revocation and the official publishing of it on the Federal Register. So you should be okay. Your commodity will be exempt from being designated alterated. So it's very important, though, that you keep good records, and this is especially true for restricted use pesticide like lorsban. You're required by law to keep application records for a minimum of 3 years. So be sure you keep good records of any of your applications this year, so you can prove that it was applied prior to the federal registration. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a change next year for many people.
Yeah. Was this a surprise?
No, they've been reviewing this for a long time, and it's been under review, and so this was a little bit of a surprise. I wasn't expecting it maybe until the field season was over with.
Yeah.
But so I was surprised a little bit. But the reason why they did take action is because of the Ninth Circuit Court order on April 29, 2021, which they were forcing the EPA to make a decision and either comply with their conditions or not. So it was kind of the EPA trying to determine whether chlorpyrifos residues were safe or not, and they were forced kind of into making this final decision.
Man, sounds like something you're going to be talking about a lot this winter as you try to patch that hole.
Yeah, it's going to be bad. We got a 2-page article coming out in the crop and pest, so there's more information in there. But yeah, we'll be talking about alternatives for you to control your insect pest, and maybe we'll have to start trying some of the newer modes of action, like the diamines, which control some pests, down the road. Of course, we have our pyrethroids, and this doesn't apply to other organophosphate. Lorsban's an organophosphate group, so other organophosphates are still available.
Okay, and I know from talking to you, you've been screening all kinds of chemistries from many different insect pests.
Yeah,
So,
unfortunately, I haven't, it's really declined over the last 5 years. There's not a lot of new modes of action coming down the road. So hopefully this may motivate some of the chemical companies to put some more research into developing newer insecticides. But if you do have significant inventories of chlorpyrifos, you might be wondering what you're going to do with them. If you have small amounts, you can probably use them on, use them as needed on sites, but that might be impractical. You can talk to your distributor about buyback programs, but I don't know of any at right now. So the other thing is you have waste pesticide collection programs, which is another option, like Project SafeSend that North Dakota has, and that would be a logical means of disposal. So, but yeah, so there's going to be a lot of question on what to do with all the inventory.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
We do know what Jan's winter looks like now.
yeah,
Yeah.
For
it's
the
gonna
meeting
be
season,
busy.
geez.
So speaking of modes of action, active ingredients, is there anything new, good or bad, on the disease side? Anything going on that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so on the fungicide market right now, it's the same situation as we don't have new modes of action that are coming tomorrow, right? We have to preserve what we have, and some of the new active ingredients may just be under one of the classes that we generally use in fungicides, which often are in the FRAC groups 3, 7, and 11, right? And probably similar for the broadleaf crops.
It
And
is.
we haven't, I guess I haven't had to bear the brunt of removal of any active ingredient yet, but it's something that's probably going to be, we have to keep on our radar, not just be prepared to update management tools as needed.
Okay. And a reminder to everyone listening, if you have questions, type them in the chat or put them on a postcard and we will collect them and answer those questions.
So we haven't talked about Goss's wilt yet.
What's that? No,
What's that? That's one disease I know about a little bit from previous meetings from you, but what do we need to think about for that disease?
Yeah, so right now is probably the best time to see if you have Goss's wilt in your field. And I look at it from a different perspective. We have situations in North Dakota where we have Goss's wilt, and you start seeing it in late July and early August, and you see fields completely burned up by it. That's the obvious example that we need a management solution. What I think about this time of the year is we've had a dry year. We still have Goss's wilt out there. Is to be understanding where those pockets are at, because our management starts now for next year. We got to start looking at the hybrids that are less susceptible and more or less being a little bit more conscientious of where we're going to place those more resistant hybrids at. So right now, Goss's wilt, if somebody would ask me how frequent is it this year, I think the safe thing is to say, well, it's going to be much less than what we've seen in the previous years, but it's still out there. We just got done with a corn disease survey, and my research crew just was able to wrap up things last week, looking at 110 fields randomly across North Dakota. We found Goss in about 10% of the fields. So what does that look like as far as the previous years? The last 3 years, we've found it in 50 to 60% of the fields. So just kind of understand that we have seen less, but part of that is probably the weather, but I don't think of it so much as drought, but I think of it as the frequency of rainstorms, which really drive that disease.
Yeah, and that's really important to manage that up on the front end, right? So you have to plan this out. A rescue treatment like a fungicide doesn't do much to Goss's, right?
Yeah, so Goss's wilt is caused by bacteria, and as the name implies, fungicides aren't going to work on a bacteria. So the next question is, what can I spray? What type of rescue treatment? With funding from the North Dakota Corn Council, we have been screening a few products out there, anything from copper sulfates, hydrogen peroxide, whatever comes across my desk, we'll take a look at it. And I can sum up the research as being inconsistent and likely not going to be able to return on your input cost on that. So really, when we look at it, cultural practices, hybrid selection, really crucial for a bacterial disease.
Yeah, and I will add that's the same in a lot of the bacterial diseases we see on the broadleaf crops.
So when I think of diseases too, I think about residue, which I love. I don't know how you guys feel about it for pests or diseases. Jan, what do we need to watch out for farmers moving to some kind of reduced till system has more residue? Maybe they're using some cover crops on the field borders or things like that. What do we need to think about for pest pressures when we add those types of things to the system?
Well, there are certain pests that do like to lay eggs in residue, like cutworms. So you do have to be careful, and be sure you monitor for those pests in the residue. I think it's a great idea, and also it's good for the beneficial insects that are out there. So it's kind of a situation where you just need to scout for those pests that you think you might see in the residue.
Okay, how about diseases? Andrew, I think you're looking
Yeah,
away
I
from me.
think we've had this conversation a few times over the years, but certainly I like to use the term residue management, right?
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean till, but maybe you're breaking up the pieces so they can break down a little bit quicker off the combine or something like that. Generally, most of the diseases I work with, the ones that are on the residue, really like the residue. The more that's out there, there's more that they're going to be able to have a kind of a happy place, right? But we have management tools in those situations. I always say variety resistance is where it starts. And then depending on the disease or what you're worried about, try to look at those other additional inputs. If it's a fungicide, when you can use it, more or less maybe a different area, maybe not be worrying about the disease as much. But when somebody says residue, I think of, can I have it for my research plots? Because that's what I'm going to use it for, right? So
I know farmers for you.
Yeah,
We got lots of
look at it
residue
from
out there.
two different ways, right? So I'm sure Sam is the same way in a lot of the diseases he works on with residue.
It is very similar. So, and maybe switching gears just a little bit to answer another question from the audience. Do you think the bans on certain pesticides, so this is to both of you, will impact which crops can be grown in certain areas? And maybe I should add grown successfully in certain areas.
I guess in my perspective, I think I'll have an impact, but I don't think it's going to restrict the growth of it. Certainly, there could be some bans, just hypothetically, that could derail management in some diseases. But for the most part, I don't potentially see that coming. I can knock on wood everywhere, right, at the same time. But that's kind of how I look at it, because a lot of times with fungicides, there's still a decision-based input. That is what it is. So it's maybe not always a checkbox on the balance sheet, but it's something that they can look at other ways to manage. I don't know what it looks like on insecticide.
Oh, well, most insect pests on the field crops, we do have multiple modes of action for control. So I would think that we could manage them, using another insecticide in a different group or IRAC group. So I don't see that as a major setback. Part of the problem with some of the other newer modes of action is they're more specific to only groups of insects. They're not as broad spectrum like the older classes of insecticides. So they may or may not control the insect that you're concerned with. But in general, I think we do have quite a few options available right now.
Okay, good.
So intensive management is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
It's a good term.
Yeah.
Intensive management.
And protect the chemicals we do have.
Yeah, and alternate your modes of action. If you have to spray more than twice for an insect pest, don't use the same mode of action like organophosphate, go organophosphate, pyrethroid. So you're rotating to different groups. So we're not promoting the development of insecticide resistance either, like we've seen with the soybean aphid and pyrethroid resistant here in the valley.
Sounds like too, if you make a change in your management, say you shift to something and reduce tillage, just monitor. And
Yeah.
you're not going to get maybe more problems, but you're going to get different problems, that associated with your system. So just watch it, make sure that you understand, what's happening. Use these drought years to look for SCN or things like that
Right.
in any system.
Right.
Yeah, and part of the problems with some of the newer modes of action is that they cost more, and that's why growers aren't using them, is because they're more expensive.
Man, well, we're to our top picks now, I think,
We
right?
are.
Got about a couple minutes left. So, Andrew, should we have your top picks?
Okay, so I'll have top picks by crop. How about this? Maybe my message going forward is, when I think about the small grain crop of this last year, Not a lot of diseases in it, but don't have short-term memory. We still have some of these long-term diseases we have to actively manage. Fusarium head blight being #1 disease, and bacterial leaf streak of wheat, although I didn't talk about it today, something to keep on the radar is our foliar disease. Now let's switch to corn, and you challenged me, Abby.
I did
So
challenge
there
you.
was I think just based off the center, I got to make my picks.
Right.
So I'm going to talk about corn a little bit. When I move into the corn diseases that I'm looking for, I said my favorite pick, and this is a pathologist's favorite pick, not a grower's, but Goss's wilt is my favorite. It's like the SEC of the FBS, or NDSU of the FCS, right? That is going to be our most important disease that we have right now. But my upset pick is going to be stalk rots this year. I think we're going to have a few more issues with stalk rots than we previously had the past 5 years. The reason being that in a dry year, we start running into some of the pathogens that take an opportunity. They start degrading the interior of the stalk. This also could be a relation of moving the nutrients to the ear. And then we're going to start running into some stalk rot issues. So not right now, but as we move forward here in the next month, maybe start thinking about checking some stalk strength in their fields just to prioritize harvesting. That's what I have.
I so appreciate the corn hat. All right, should we go to Jan next? What are your top picks?
Well, rather than pick a certain insect, I would say that my top 3 things are to scout frequently for insect pests, and then also use economic thresholds so we're not spraying when we don't need to be spraying. The thresholds are developed to let you know when you'll recoup that cost of the insecticide back in your yield of your crop. And then I would say also to alternate modes of action if you have to spray more than twice. So we don't get insecticide resistance, which really complicates making management decisions down the road.
Great, thank you. And you, Sam, what are your top?
Well, I think the most important thing is to get in the fields now and take a look. If you've got soybeans that are going down, look in those spots, try to figure out what's going on. It could be a disease and you might be able to manage it better in the future. I'd say if you're going soybeans or dry beans, the most important thing is to sample for soybean cyst nematode. Get in there and take a look for that. And I would say charcoal rot could show up in quite a few of the broadleaf crops. Soybeans, dry beans, sunflower, could show up in corn too. I would expect to see a lot more of that than we have in the past years just because of the drought.